Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. This webinar around yFiles for HTML 3.0. I'm so excited to show you today what we have been doing in the past. Well, it's actually almost 15 months that we've been cooking up yFiles 3.0, and I'm excited to show you today what we have done. So let's get this started. So first, about me. For those who don't know me, I'm Sebastian Mueller. I'm CTO of yWorks, and I oversee all of the technical development at yFiles. These are the social contacts that you can use to get in contact with us or me. Feel free to follow us to get new news about yFiles and yFiles for HTML. So what is this all about? So today I'm going to explain to you what is yFiles for HTML version 3.0, and that is a major new generation of yFiles. And it's an evolutionary step. We have been working with yFiles for more than 25 years now, and yFiles for HTML is more than 13 years old. It's getting 13 this year, and we're at 3.0. What does it mean? It's an evolutionary step, meaning that we build upon what was good, but we changed the defaults. We streamlined the API. We worked through all of the APIs that we have and changed them for a better developer experience. But also, we changed and modernized the UI, the user interface that your end users will see when they interact with applications built on yFiles for HTML. So today I'm going to show you what we did, how we changed the UI, and how we changed the API. This new generation is supposed to be future-proof, not just for you, but also for us, meaning that on this solid foundation that we built, it will enable us to add new features in the future without sacrificing backwards compatibility again and getting new features out more quickly to you. And also version 3.0 already has some new features, and now I'm going to show you some of them in this webinar. And for those of you who are afraid of the change, why did we go to version 3? We've listened to your feedback, and we really invested heavily into making yFiles 3.0 a better user experience for both the developers and your customers. And I'm sure that by the end of this session, you'll understand and see and agree with me that this is a good move. We already ported many of our examples, more than 1,000 code examples, more than 300 source code examples, and a couple of large applications like our online editor Wildlife to the new API, and it worked nice. And we found some bugs and regressions internally. Of course, we already started to love the new API, and I hope that you will too once you get to use it. So what's the exact agenda for today? So I'm going to show you the new features that we added to the layout algorithms in yFiles, meaning those features that will be available not just to the JavaScript web version of yFiles, but also to the versions for the desktop using C# and Java. We're also going to look at the view features, what changed in the view, what those parts that actually make up the visualization of the graph and the user interactions. So we're going to take a look at how we improved the user experience for your end users, but also for our users, the developers who are working with our library, how they can benefit from using the new version. So we're going to look at the developer experience and the API improvements around yFiles 3.0. Then we'll also take a quick look at the migration tool that we created for you to quickly migrate your current source code to version 3.0 so that you can quickly benefit from the new features. And we'll end by a Q&A session. If there's any questions that you have during the webinar, feel free to write them in the chat. My colleagues are monitoring the chat and will be either handing them over to me for the end Q&A session, or we'll get back to you via email or directly answer your questions in the chat. So without further ado, let's go to the new features in the layout algorithms. So the most prominent and most sophisticated layout that we have in yFiles is called the hierarchical layout. And this one got a new feature, and this is called port alignment. So what is this? In this example over here, you see two examples. One graph that is a simple layered graph going from the left-hand side to the right-hand side. And as you can see, there's actually edges that belong together, like these red edges. There's 4 red edges over here, but they conceptually belong to one stream, to one path, to one story in this thing. And with the traditional layout like we had before, it was very hard to align them properly so that those paths are easy to follow. And with the new version in 3.0, you can now configure the algorithm and tell it that these edges actually belong together, so that the edges, in this case of the same color and thickness, belong together, and they will be aligned on either sides of the nodes like this. And this results in a much clearer visualization, as you will probably agree, and is super helpful in use cases like when you're doing storytelling, like we do in our Marvel graph, for example, where we actually had to write lots and lots of code before to get this working, and it's now available at your fingertips with just a simple configuration option. You can use this also for things like supply chains or Sankey diagrams, of course. And there's a demo. I'm not going to show this demo right now, but it's already online and you can check it out there, play with the code. Let's go to the next example. Another feature that we added to the hierarchical layout is something that you actually requested a lot from us is to get the results more symmetric. So the top example is a result that you would get from yFiles 2.x. And in the below example, that's a new version where we configured the way, or we let the user configure the way that symmetry is handled. Strictly speaking, the above result has fewer bands and is actually more compact because, well, there's obviously no band in here and in here, whereas here you have additional bands, and it's actually those nodes are closer together, so it's a more compact result. But I guess you will agree with me that the below version feels much more balanced and more fair, and so it's probably because it doesn't seem to like arbitrarily favor one of these edges and renders them in a without bends. So the new setting that you can configure will allow you to get a much more balanced layout. So this can result in less compact drawings and more bands, but it's probably worth the setting. The next layout is the force-directed one called organic layout. And this one has a feature where it can highlight clusters in your graph. And you can specify those clusters manually, like, for example, tell it to put all the red nodes on a certain cluster, or let the algorithm automatically perform the clustering and then highlight the clusters in your drawing. And the above result is a very simplistic result where we were just using the force-directed algorithm to come up with a drawing. But specifically for this layout, we now allow the developer to specify how those last clusters should be arranged specifically in the graph. And so this greatly enhances the visual clarity and makes it easier for your users to recognize the structure and of the clusters themselves and the clusters. There's different options that you have. For example, you can change these to put all of the elements in a cluster on a single cycle, or to use these compact disk approach over here, for example. Another feature, which is actually not a new feature, but an improvement, is that we greatly sped up the calculation for the force-directed layout for the super large graphs. So while typically we're not really fans of rendering large graphs, and in my opinion, if you really need, if you run into situations where the running time gets high, you're probably displaying a graph that your users won't be happy with either way. But anyway, in this round, we implemented a major algorithmic speed up for the organic layout. And depending on the size of the node, this will easily result in a speed up of up to factor 10 or more. And this table that we have here compares the running times between version 2 and version 3. And take note that this is in the high quality setting, so this takes a little longer. But with a new algorithmic speed up, you get like much smaller running times, or if you're not into large graphs, you get a higher quality for the smaller graphs in the same time if you want to. So this is just an algorithmic speed up, and it doesn't use things like multi-threading or GPU layout and so. And for those platforms that support this, you will get this speed up on top of the current performance. Last but not least, something that's not really part of the layout, but it's also part of the algorithmic parts. We added a better path search algorithm, specifically the algorithm that determines the k shortest path. So not just the shortest path, but the second, third, and so on shortest path. While we had this feature before already, the old implementation wasn't able to deal with non-simple paths, meaning that for example, the second shortest path in this graph from start to end goes like in a loop around here and then back here, which is probably not what you want in most interactive use cases where you want to really show a distinct, separate, simple path to the user, which in this case would be the detour around here. So this algorithm, which is essential for things like transportation planning or network routing, where you never come across the same node twice, even if there's a cycle and it's the second shortest path. This is a very good algorithm. Now let's take a look at what's new for the viewer part, for the interaction part. So for the actual visualization, not the layout, but the visualization. And the following features are mostly for the yFiles for HTML version, which is going to be released first, but it will also be available in the other platforms. So let's take a look at them. So with yFiles, you always had the option to come up with your own custom style. So if you have your designer and comes up with a nice visualization for a node or for an edge, you were always able to use to come up with an implementation that it looks exactly as the way the designer intended it to look. But of course, out of the box, you also get a number of styles. They will help you to get started quickly. And for many use cases, they will already be sufficient. So we reviewed all of the ones that we had, as well as aspects like the arrowheads, like the number of shapes that we had, the naming of the shapes, and things like that. We reviewed them and improved the defaults and added more choices. One example is the arrowheads over here. So of course, you can have your own arrowheads, but the ones that are default available in the library are the ones that you can see up here. They are very flexible, meaning you can change things like scale the width or the height separately, change the fill color or the stroke color independently of the line color, and so on. But with the new defaults, you can also customize things like whether an edge point should end at the visual border of a node or at the actual connection point at the port inside. It's also much easier now to use custom polygons or star. So these are not just now a single line of configuration if you want your, 37 pointed stars shape. So much more, many more default, more choices for the out-of-the-box experience. The same for the labels. The labels have the ones that come out of the box now have an additional property. Something that you could do before already with manual styling now becomes basically a 3-line code change. And this is, in this example, we're showing how to add a background shape to an icon. So this is a label over here. This is an icon on top of the label, the white one. And actually the blue circle with the orange line around is actually something that's part of the styling. So these are all 3 different aspects, and the rendering of background shapes is something that's new for the icon label styles and also for the visualization of nodes. Also, what's also shown in here is that we greatly improved the options that you have for trimming the text in a node. So if your text gets too long, you can now configure whether you want them to be trimmed on a character boundary or a word boundary, or simply clipped at the end, or whether you do want to wrapping at character or word boundary, or not at all, etc. And all these settings, the new shapes and the wrapping also work with the WebGL version. So you can now just switch between the two versions and get basically the same visualizations for the default styles. We also added a number of utility styles that developers can use to basically build their own styles on top of existing ones, or maybe on top of their custom ones. And the first one is the so-called delegating style. It's available for nodes, edges, ports, and labels for all the styles that we have. And this one basically makes it easy to delegate dynamically data dependent to different styling. So you can assign the same instance, but have the style automatically bind to your data or to other settings in your application. And this is super easy to do, and especially helpful if you use it together with the composite node style, which is also a decoration, which in this case is pretty obvious what it will do. It will combine two or more styles into a single one. So in this case, it will be rendered on top of each other. And this allows you to, with just a few lines of code, to come up to create completely new visualizations. Like in this screenshot over here, this is basically the code that you require to come up with this new style over here. Because by default, you don't have things like these double stroke lines over here. You can just simulate these by rendering two nodes on top of each other while not changing the model. Obviously, you don't have two nodes in your model. It's just the visualization that changes. Last but not least, we also added the shape port style, which makes it much easier to actually render the connection points in a nice way. It basically has the same feature as the shape node style, meaning you can specify fill, color, and the shape and the size. Now to the UI element the UI elements in the visualization that do not belong to the graph directly. Things like scroll bars or the handles that the user interacts with when they work with your graph visualization. We reviewed our settings, we changed the defaults, we came up with a much more modern look and feel by default, and we added a few more features in there. So for example, you can now specify the padding around elements for the selection. And we changed the default for the scroll bars, which are now fully CSS stylable with CSS variables dynamically animated. If you want to change the color, look, and feel, and so on, it's all just a CSS configuration step away. Changing colors and making the diagram perfectly match your UI is now easier than never before. And yeah, that's it. Sorry. We also changed the way that interactions with the graph work, meaning that from users who are used to working with tools like PowerPoint or Photoshop or other well-known applications where they interact with like vector graphics, we changed our defaults to perfectly match their default. So the key bindings that by default are there are now aligned with most of the applications that you will find out there. There's no consistent application key binding out there, but we took inspiration from the best and most frequently used applications out there and adjusted our implementation to work like that. Now you can do things like instantly edit labels just by starting to type. You don't have to hit F2. You can start edge creation right from selected and unselected nodes, and you can start dragging nodes immediately without first having to select them if you want to have a single selection. You can also directly create edges without first having to deselect a node, and so on. You can interactively constrain the movement, add snap lines just by pressing a modifier key, with something which was before just the other way around. So where you always had this enabled and you only were able to disable it, you can now enable parts of these interactions, as you may know these interactions from, for example, PowerPoint. And we also changed the way that multi-select works by default, in the way that if you press a modifier click like Shift or Alt or Control, you can now replace, add, subtract, or toggle the selection just by holding the modifier. And this works the same with the lasso selection too. We also changed the way that we support those nifty devices, those touchpads, those so-called magic or precision touchpads that you will find on MacBooks or on, for example, Surface devices, so that you can now easily zoom and pan out of the box with your touchpads, which sounds like it's easy, but it's actually something that the web platform won't give you access to. Now we found a way to distinguish between the horizontal and vertical wheel events, so you can use a mouse wheel in both directions at the same time and still use your touchpad to conveniently navigate your graph. And we also refined the API to work with stylus input, so we're now supporting mouse, touch, and stylus with a simplified, unified pointer API. So if you want to change the configuration, how the user interacts with your graph, you can now easily specify the different behaviors for the various devices. Another thing that changed with the 3.0 release is the way that we treat the infinite canvas. Traditionally, yFiles had an infinite canvas, and it still has, but this meant that you were able to easily just lose your graph. Specifically, if you're using touch devices, you're starting to use your fingers to navigate around. It could happen that you were scrolling too far away and never found your graph again, basically. So by default now, we changed the way that the viewport navigation is limited, and we added a set of policies that we found to be super intuitive to use, which limit your way of navigation. You can still disable that feature and get those infinite canvas, but now the size of the canvas will automatically adjust to your contents, and when navigating, you should not be able to lose your graph as quickly as before. So this works both with touch navigation, with keyboard navigation, and with mouse, of course, and also works with isometric projection, as we see here in this example. One of my favorite features we have in the view is the refactored snapping API. Snapping is the process of showing these guidelines to the user when the user moves elements in the diagram. And we had this for, I think, 16 years now, but we only ever had this for orthogonal snap lines. So you could only snap to horizontal or vertical lines in the case of nodes. For labels, you could also snap to angled lines, but this didn't work for nodes. And since we unified and refactored the API, we now add the option to also snap to arbitrary lines or line segments, as well as circles or arc segments. And now this enables users users who don't want to use the automatic layout or want to change, make manual adjustments to the automatic layout for graphs that are inherently non-orthogonal, for example, the force-directed graphs, to get very nice results easily, because it will automatically snap to proper angles so that you can divide angles or use the same edge lengths as neighboring edges, for example. But all of this is something that you as a developer has full control over. So you can specify what should happen to what kind of circles should be displayed, and what items should snap to what elements in the view. This works with a new unified API. This works the same for labels and nodes and everything else in the graph, even for brands, and it's now much easier to configure and actually to use. A very minor improvement, but something that has been requested quite a number of times, is that traditionally in yFiles for HTML, we didn't have a built-in context menu. We had a context menu, the infrastructure available, but we didn't provide the visual aspect of a context menu, because in the web platform there is no default web platform context menu available. So we thought that our customers would bring their own custom menu implementation anyway that matches their UI framework. But with recent advancements in CSS styling, we now added a default simple context menu out of the box, so you don't have to bring your own menu anymore, and you can still customize it using CSS. And it's actually a pretty complete implementation. Of course, you can do things like add labels and icons and enable states and separators and so on. So this results in much fewer code and has a really nice default implementation. But still, you can still bring your own implementation if you want to, of course. So now let's take a look at some APIs and look how they changed, how things have gotten easier for developers and how developer experience improved. Let's start by first looking at the parts in the viewer. As a developer, you typically need to react to events that happen. For example, when the user clicks on an item or creates a node, you want to get notified, react to this event, and then, for example, trigger a call to a database also. And so far, we used an eventing mechanism that was very similar to the one that you find in languages like C# and Java. And with this release, we decided to make it more in line with the DOM API. So you have now with this release, you have this add event listener calls where you first specify the name of the event, and then you get the event details. And this is the way that your developers will know it from the web platform. This also allowed us to add a new feature, which is the event listener options, which are also taken from the developer platform. They allow you to, for example, to only get notified once of a certain event, and it will automatically unregister the listener after the event fired. Also, you can use the web platform's native board controller signals to automatically unregister a whole number of events at once with a single line of code, just by calling control board or synchronizing this to a promise that you have because you failed something, some request to a server failed, and so on. So this makes event configuration code a lot easier to work with. When you're configuring the interaction to work the way that you want your users to work with the graph, there is this class called Graph Editor Input Mode or Graph Viewer Input Mode, and it has tons of settings that allow you as a developer to specify exactly how the user interacts with the diagram. We made it much easier to configure in this release. Not only did we review all of the API names and made sure that they align with each other and that you're using the same concepts everywhere, we made it much easier to make slightly more sophisticated configurations, like in this example, where, for example, you can determine on a per item basis whether you want an item to be selectable, clickable, movable, editable, and so on. And where previously you had to create subclasses of this complex class, you can now just pass in a predicate and be done with it. And so this is much more easy to configure and scales better than subclassing. Also in this code example, you see the way that you configure orthogonal edge routing, which previously required I think at minimum 6 or 7 lines of code. You can now just specify on a per item basis, on a per edge basis, whether you want it to be orthogonally edited, and that's all you need to do. This will automatically enable the orthogonal editing. So when users create new edges or edit existing edges, they will stay orthogonal just by toggling this setting on the various edges. The same holds true for the context, for the snapping context, which is responsible for enabling the interactive snapping that I just showed you. And this is just now one enabled true line of code away. It will automatically work once you add this configuration. yFiles for HTML specifically has these various rendering modes. So you can render your graph elements using SVG, HTML, HTML5 Canvas, WebGL1, WebGL2. And for the WebGL2 styles, that we added to yFiles, I think 3 versions ago, we were using a separate code path. And because they aren't as configurable as the rest of the ones, because they actually use shaders and are thus slightly less flexible. So we have for these styles, we actually have a limited set of styles because it's much more difficult for a developer to implement their own styling on top of our engine. So this explained why we're using a different code path, but we found that this was awkward to use, and since we really love throwing away duplicate code, we came up with a way that you can now treat those styles exactly the same as the other styles. So a WebGL shape node style now also implements the regular inode style interface, and you can use it in exact same spots where you were using the regular styles. So switching from SVG to WebGL is now easier, way easier before. So you can use the same code for example, to specify the defaults, or for serialization, or for the folding, or the clipboard operations, or all the interactions as before, and you don't have to make any adjustments anymore. You just specify the style that you want to use. And for those cases where you're using a hybrid rendering approach, where, for example, you're rendering WebGL for the larger graphs and switch to SVG for all the close-up zooms, we added this convenience class, which lets you specify how to combine these two styles. So when you're switching from the SVG rendering to the WebGL rendering, you can have 2 different styles that perfectly match your styles, and it's now just a code, 1 line of configuration code away. So this helps with LOD rendering, something that we didn't really expect our customers to use a lot when we came up with the WebGL rendering. But since this is a frequently requested feature, we heard you and now integrated this more deeply into the standard rendering mechanism. Now this one gets super expert, so I'm going to quickly go over this. As I just explained in yFiles for HTML, if you want to go really deep down into the rendering, you can use all these different technologies, Canvas HTML and SVG. And now this is all neatly tucked away into one property on the graph component. It's called render tree, and this one manages all the low-level rendering aspects. So if you don't need them, you probably won't come across them. But if you do them, they're all in one place, and they come with a couple of convenience methods, which makes it much easier to add additional visualizations on top of your graph right onto the canvas. So if you want to have some funky background rendering, it's now much easier to add this to your visualization. The render tree helps you create these elements, remove them, but also manage the Z order and so on, and it also renders the various technologies on top of each other or at the same time. In this regard, there's also one new interface that we streamlined, and that's the interface that's used for the various tasks of rendering items. So there's, of course, rendering the styles like the items like nodes or edges and ports. But previously we had a slightly different mechanism or interface for rendering things like highlights or selection or the focus indicator, or even things like the handles or the snap lines. So they were all using slightly different interfaces. And now this has all been streamlined into a single interface. So if you know how to implement one of these, it's super easy to implement the others too. So this example at the bottom here, for example, shows how to change the rendering of the handles. So there's this specific input mode in there where you can just specify your own renderer, and it tells you exactly what options you have that you need to consider to render your items. And in this case, we're just rendering all handles in a red style using custom canvas rendering code. But of course, we could be getting much more sophisticated here, but the interface is always the same, whether you're dealing with any of these tasks. And we're almost done with super expert code, so please stay with me for a few more seconds. This is regarding the lookup API. The lookup API is how you add specific features to graph items on a per item basis in a almost like a declarative manner. So if you want a certain behavior of your items to be just the way that, well, your UX designer specifies it to be, you can do this with the lookup API. And the lookup API is used across various parts of the library. And now we're using the same API to modify these in all places. So there's just these four methods are left that we have here. So you can set a constant implementation for all the places. You can specify a factory that will dynamically determine, in this case, how a node will be repositioned. Or you can wrap an existing implementation and delegate to it, or you can just remove the existing implementation. And this is the same for the graph, for the canvas context, and for the input, and so on. The last one is about a feature that is relatively new in the web platform, and that's about iterator API. yFiles had these iterators since day one, since 20 years ago, and only recently a similar API has been brought to the web platform. So this is to efficiently work with all kinds of collections in yFiles. For example, if you want to sort your nodes, group them, filter them, map and reduce them, and so on. This all works via the interface that we had since day one, but which is very similar to the interface that has now recently been proposed and implemented in the browser. And so we made just a few adjustments so that the API is exactly the same as in the proposal. So if you know the native platform API, you can use it with yFiles just the same right now. And if you're on a browser that supports these the native iterator API, our internal API now extends this feature. So if new features get added to the platform, they will automatically become available to the yFiles API because we're using the native one. Now for the changes that we did for the layout part. So this is for the experts among you who really need to dig down into the layout configurations and layout customization. So if you want to specify how the automatic layout exactly arranges your items on the screen, this is the API that you typically need to work with. The most important change, and actually the biggest change that we made to the library, is that we changed the graph implementation that we're using for the layout. There in yFiles, there's two different graph implementations. One that's mostly used for the visualization. It has all the things like the styling information, like the colors and the text of the labels and so on. But for the automatic algorithms, layout algorithms, there's actually an optimized graph implementation, which is much more lightweight and doesn't carry all this additional information that's not required for the layout. So this allows us to get the best performance. But it also had the issue that it was a separate API. This API actually originated from 1998, I believe, when the first API was written in Java at this time. And we had this API up until now. But now with this release, we changed the API so that they are aligned to each other, meaning that if you know the code for the one graph, you can use it basically exactly the same for the other graph. Let me show you how the API differs. So now this is the API for the layout graph. So this is, if you're working with the low-level layout API, this is the code you would have to write. And now I'm going to switch over to the view API and see the changes. It's basically just one change in there, and that is the way that a label is specified. Obviously, as I just told you, the layout algorithm doesn't know about the contents of the text of your label, so that's the only change you need to make. Any other code will be exactly the same. The way that you create your nodes, the way that you add labels, the way that you configure the layouts, run the layouts, and the way that you read the values from the layout is now exactly the same. So if you're typically, our customers start with a view graph and build their proof of concept, and if they ever have to deal with the layout graph, then they will be now feel right at home, because the API is almost identical. Another frequently another common task for customizing layouts is if you're configuring an automatic layout, or if you're combining different layouts into one. So if you, for example, want to have a specific routing style combined with a different node placement style, or mix and match them together. Previously, if you look at the above code, some parts were quite difficult to do and hard to understand if you read the code. We changed the default so that the different stages in the layout now recognize each other automatically, and they get reconfigured automatically, so that you basically now only have to specify what you want the layout to do and not how that works. So it's just a declarative way to specify how your layout should look like, and yFiles will figure out the rest. So this results in a much more concise declaration of how you configure your layout. For example, for the tree layout, there's now a strongly typed configuration for the various properties that make sense for this layout, whereas previously we gave you all the various settings at the top level, even if they really weren't that useful for this specific layout. And with this release, we've focused on the main use cases, and while they're still there, we made sure that you won't stumble across them by accident. So if you're looking you're looking at the code completion in your IDE, you get exactly those properties that you should be looking at. So all of this is strongly typed, meaning that you get code completion and code documentation in your IDE. Nothing of this is just, even if it looks just like a JSON, everything works with code completion and documentation. And it's much more easier to read, even in a really complicated configuration like this one. Another thing that we did is we streamlined the configuration for common options that you typically need to turn on or off or configure in your algorithms. For example, the way that node labels or edge labels are placed by an algorithm, these now work the same across all the algorithms, whereas previously there were slight differences and nuances between those algorithms. There's now a streamlined API for this, and if you know how to configure one of the algorithms, it's the same with the other algorithms too. Here's an example for the labeling API. In the old one, you had to first create the force-directed layout, the organic layout over here, and then create the labeling approach, and then actually combine these two and then specify what to do. And now you just have the choice of doing an integrated labeling where supported, or doing a generic labeling, or no labeling at all. And it's the same API across all algorithms. Last but not least, if you're working with JavaScript and want to not block the main thread and run your layouts in a web worker, this has gotten a lot easier. It's basically just these, 3 lines of code to run your layout in a separate worker. And that's all you need to do. Whereas before you had to do the message passing between the layouts, between the different workers yourself. There's now a default implementation that works great with web workers. So no more frozen UIs for your end users. You had that before already, but it's now easier to configure. So now lots of changes in there. So how difficult or easy is it to migrate from version 2.x to 3.0? And let me just show you the tool that we created for that purpose. And so let me just switch to an IDE. Here's some code that uses yFiles 2.6 from an npm package. It's just kitchen sink code, so it's not really super useful code, but it shows the various types of changes that we made. So this is yFiles 2.6 code, and it compiles and it works nicely with TypeScript. It's a TypeScript file, and you see it's all green code. And now if I want to convert this code to work with yFiles 3.0, for example, to get the new listener statement, of course I could be doing this manually, but the idea is to let this do a tool. We did some renamings in there. We moved some APIs from here and there, as I showed you before. And I'm going to show you how this tool will automatically adjust the code and help you do the migration easily. So there's a tool that we have on NPM. It's the yWorks Migrate yFiles app NPM package. So I'm just using the latest version here, specifying where the sources are located. And then I just need to hit enter. It will go fetch the package and will do the migration for me. Now there's something red, but that's because I'm still on the old yFiles version. So I'm going to quickly uninstall the old version of yFiles and install the new one. And now we're on version 3.0. And this is the code. And there is almost no red code anymore. We see that the import statement has adjusted, and there's some comments in here which tell me what parts I need to work on. For example, in this case, there's no clear mapping. We removed that property for the sake of having 2 separate properties in here. So it's you need to decide which one you actually want to have here. So you can just go in here and paste this one in, and then it will compile again. So what did it do? My recommendation is, before you run this code, of course, do check in your code so that you have clean checkout. This allows you to use your diff tool to see what actually changes they're made. Let's make it slightly smaller. And now we see that there's actually lots of changes that it did here. So it adjusted the listeners in here. It inserted this comment. For example, here we changed a default setting where you didn't specify a default before. So we are warning you that unless you're happy with the new default, which you probably are, you might be reverting that setting to the old setting. So you have to change the setting so that you get the old behavior back. Here's a simple renaming where previously we had these 2 constants over here. Now it's just a simple Boolean. Here we moved a class. And here we changed the name, and here we changed the signature. And for this example, we're already done. Of course, there's code that will be slightly more difficult to migrate. But as I told you before, we migrated tens of thousands of lines of code already using this tool. And this is super helpful. And it took us just a few days for some of the larger applications to completely migrate them. If you know our app generator, it took the developers 2 days to migrate it from the old version of yFiles to a new one, and it's super, and it has a really complicated and very a code base that really goes deep and uses all of the yFiles features. So typically we expect for the simple applications for you to be able to convert them in very, very short time, meaning literally just days. So this is it already. So this is what we've seen, what's coming to yFiles 3.0 in 2025. So I showed you parts of the streamlined API, and I'm super happy that we did this step, and I think you will be too. It's not only for the new customers who will feel right at home when they start with the API with the new defaults. It's also for the existing customers who want to add new features that maybe were even possible to add before, but were complicated to add now. With the new API, it should be much easier to add those features, and that we already have in yFiles, and the ones that we'll be adding in the futures. I showed you that the 3.0 release also comes with new features for the layout and the view, and we worked hard to improve the developer experience and make yFiles easier to work with. And there's an automatic migration available that will allow you to port your existing applications to yFiles 3.0. The early access program is available since December, so if you haven't downloaded it already, you can do so now. And if you download it today, it will be almost exactly the same version as the final release, which is expected to be end of February, meaning if all goes well, by the end of next week, you have the final general availability version of yFiles for HTML 3.0 available, in which you can go live and bring to your customers so that they can enjoy the new features. The corresponding versions for C# and Java will follow later this year, and they will have most of the goodies, apart from the JavaScript goodies, of course, the same. So they will also benefit from the new API, the modernized UI, and get the new features. So now I'm happy to take your questions. There's this QR code over here showing this, which leads you to that URL over there, and that URL leads to a document that has links to all of the various code snippets that I showed you, and you can play with them live. So if you click on these links, you will get to the live playground using which runs the yFiles for HTML version 3 code, and you can take a look at the code, play with the features, and see what's in it for you. And also, of course, please do take a look at our demos and play around with them and let us know your feedback. Now let me see to your questions. I saw that there were a number of questions coming in during it. So the first question is the speed up only for organic layouts or generally? This specific speed up that I showed, the huge speed up, was due to an algorithmic change for the organic layout. So this specific speed up is only part of the organic layout. But since we changed the inner workings of yFiles, we also saw improvements across all the algorithms, because we changed the way that our internal collections and algorithms work. We switched to newer, more modern code, and this also resulted in performance improvements in many places. Not as drastic as this one, but there were improvements. And with the changes that we did to the code base, we are now much more confident that we will be able to get even more improvements on the algorithmic level in the future, because it's easier for us to add new features to the code base with all the, with the technical debt removed that accumulated over the past 25 years. So expect more performance improvements to come after this release. This release wasn't really about new performance. It was about increasing your performance as a developer. And so this was only a gift that we we added to this release for the organic layout, but expect more to come soon. Is the documentation going to be updated at the same time of the release? Yeah, definitely. The current early access package already has a few updates in documentation, but I can tell you that for the last 4 weeks, like I think almost 3/3 of the team, 3/3, 3/4 of the team has been working on updating the documentation. So it's not just updated to match the current API, but we also reworked the documentation and made it more precise, more in-depth in those parts where we found that it would require more depth. So this will be available very soon, maybe even before the release, but definitely for the release. We might be uploading the documentation even before the final availability release, general availability release. Will there be new demos for the refined new features? Yeah, of course. They will also be on Git, right? Correct, you're right. These currently the demos on GitHub are the ones for 2.x because those are the ones that have been released. The new features and code is part of the evaluation version of 3.0, which is already available, so you can get that. But we will of course update them on GitHub soon too. Is the viewpoint limiter constraint something that is tied to a specific input mode, or can it be changed, applied to either editor input mode or view? Yes, it's an orthogonal thing in the way that you can enable it or disable it for each and every scenario that you think it's a good idea. So it's something that works for actually across input modes, even if there's no input mode. But typically it's super helpful for the view input mode, and you might actually want to disable it for your power users that are editing your graphs and they don't want to run in these constraints. And another question for the configuration, is it reverse compatible? Meaning, is my current config of graph in input mode going to still work on 3.0? Yes and no. Most of the configurations should work. Some of the configurations have changed in an incompatible way. We hope for the better, but there will be cases where you won't like those settings, as we've seen when the migration tool ran. It spit out these warnings. That's one of these cases where if you, for example, if you disabled the way items can be moved, now that we have two ways that users can move items, selected and unselected moves by default, you might have to turn the other way, the other option off too. So this is something that can't happen automatically. But for the basic configurations, I'm quite positive that it will still work with 3.0. If not, please send us your feedback, and we're going to update the migration tool and add more hints and migration logic in there if we find that there's a frequent use case. So if you found that the migration code tool didn't work for your code, please send us your code and we'll take a look and see whether we can improve the migration tool. We'll definitely tell you what you will need to do as long as a workaround, as long as the migration tool doesn't do that automatically for you. So please do contact our support team. We'll be happy to help. Your feedback is really welcome and appreciated. Another one. Many questions. Are there any performance differences between using an SVG-based solution and an HTML-based solution for rendering elements on the yFiles canvas? Yes, there are, but there's no general recommendation we can give for very large graphs. Probably WebGL 2 is your best option. But for smaller graphs, for the more detailed ones, it's not always clear. If your graph is very text heavy, if there's lots of text, most browser engines render text in HTML slightly faster than in SVG. So you might consider going with HTML. But I'd say for the majority of use cases, the SVG rendering is probably good enough. Is it recommended in terms of speed, memory usage, or interaction handling? Interaction handling, it works best with a non-WebGL, which has takes some shortcuts to get the best performance. So things like snapping don't work as nicely in the WebGL. So if you want to have a really high quality editing experience, you should probably switch to SVG or HTML or Canvas. The only thing that you would want to avoid is probably the WebGL rendering, which is really for those super large graphs where precision is not so important, but really just raw performance for many items. And but well, you can always combine these techniques in a level of detail approach. But the best advice I can give you is start with SVG, and if you run into performance issues, do let us know, because oftentimes there's ways that you can improve the performance with SVG, which typically gets the best user experience from a graphic fidelity point of view, and it's also the most versatile when it comes to exporting your graph to Visio, to PDFs, or to high quality bitmap graphics. And so do let us know if you run into any of these issues. When do you plan to release the stable version? Yeah, as I said, it's planned for, well, if all goes well, end of next week. If we find a few more bugs, or you report more bugs, it might take a little longer than that. But I'm very positive that we had that version out in the early access program for 3 months now, and we have it running in Wired Live and our desktop applications for a couple of weeks now, which we are monitoring. And as I said, we are pretty confident that the version that we will be releasing next week is very stable and something that you can build upon. If not, we're going to, of course, provide bug fix releases in a timely fashion. In this new version, there are some improvements about folding functionality. Yeah, right. I didn't touch upon the folding API, which has been reworked and actually improved significantly. It's now much easier to, for example, sync labels. So folding is about when you, let me show, I think we actually have a demo over there. Where's my, so folding, there is this one. This is something that was quite hard to do before, and it's now super easy from a code perspective. It was possible before too, but now it's very easy. Now consider you have multiple edges, and if you do folding, now you get these placeholder edges which show how these elements connect to each other. And what was previously quite difficult to do is adjust like the labels when they were merged. So for example, now this edge over here represents two edges, but it's just a single edge, and specifying how the label is rendered, for example, is now much easier. The whole process of converting multiple of these like real edges to those placeholder edges, and also the way that the styling changes of the edges and the nodes when they get into the folding state is now much easier to configure, and actually also more efficient internally. So expect improvements here. I think the documentation hasn't been released for the updated, but so if you're interested, wait a few more days and then you can read more about this in the documentation. The code is already in the EAP version, so feel free to check that out. And another one. For the migration tool, how does it work? Is it going to strictly update the code using the 3.0 APIs? For example, if we have not the yFiles import, but a yFiles hosted on a private package, which would have a different import name? That's a good question. I think right now it wouldn't recognize it, but if that's a frequent use case, that should be easy to support. I'll go and check with the team. Maybe this is something that we can add on top, because I believe that might be a common use case. I think right now it wouldn't, because it actually uses TypeScript to identify the types, and obviously it looks for types in the yFiles namespace, and in order not to break your existing code. And if you renamed that code, obviously it would think that this is your code and wouldn't make the change. So probably it won't work right now. Please leave your email in the chat, and we'll get back to you soon with more details on this. That's a good question. But technically it should be easy to do, because we have we look for this specific name and then do the migration. Obviously you could also just do a search and replace on the text and install the current version next to it, just to make it compile, basically, so that the migration tool will work. And then you can use the yFiles 3.0, which actually, as you may have seen, has a slightly different namespace. It uses an organizational namespace at yFiles, which should make it much easier for you to remap the NPM in the future. Hi Sebastian, in the case of large datasets to be viewed through yFiles HTML, how to balance CPU load between server and client side? Would you recommend one approach? Oh, that's a complicated question, something that's probably not a good fit for this webinar, but I'll try to give a quick answer and then let the team get back to you. Specifically for this release, there haven't been many changes, other than that now that the API is basically the same for the layout, and you can use the layout API also on your server. It should be much easier for you to bring your code to the server side and then split the layout between the server and the client if you need that. So honestly, you ask whether I would recommend one approach. My recommended approach typically is don't do the split, but do all on the client side. There's only very few use cases where doing the calculation on the server side is beneficial. It's only beneficial if it's super large graphs, which in a way you should be trying to avoid anyway. And when you're actually calculating the same layouts for many clients, then it might make sense to put this on the server. Other than this, typically it scales much better to put the layout on the client side. Okay. I think, another one. Lately, I have been issues trying to find the demo code for the respective demo that I'm viewing. Yeah, that's because, as I try to explain, that the online demos on yfiles.com/demos are the version 3.0 demos, and the source code for them is not yet on GitHub. It's in the package, so if you need that source code, please take a look into the package that you can download today. And the ones on GitHub are the released versions, and we don't have the 3.0 versions on GitHub yet, but this will change next week. But in the meantime, please take a look at the sources in the package. And if you're looking for the old demos, they are still on live.yworks.com. These are still the 2.x demos, so we host them both on different locations at the moment. Okay, one more, and I think then that's it. Minimum browser question about minimum browser requirements. I think I didn't tell you that, but we dropped Internet Explorer compatibility. So if you still want to support IE version 9, 10, and 11, even down to 9, you will have to stay on yFiles for HTML 2.6, because there have been some changes in the code that probably you won't be able to polyfill, like the CSS variables and things like that, which really helped us trim down the code and make life for you as a developer much easier, but which meant that you can't use IE anymore, which you shouldn't. So we require a modern browser, and this is the first version for yFiles HTML where we actually do a cut. So it should be an evergreen browser or one with an LTS support. So all the browsers that have been released in the I'd say last 2 or 3 years should work, and as a rule of thumb. But but it's a modern IDE library for the modern web browsing. Anything new on the React front? Well, no, not really new. yFiles for HTML 3.0 works great with React, just the same as the old one. If you haven't seen them, we have those React wrapper components available on GitHub at a separate downloads, as free downloads on top as an add-on for yFiles. And we have migrated them to yFiles 3.0 just the same. So if you want to use them, you can also use the React wrappers with 3.0. I think they are not yet released. They will be at the same time that 3.0 will be finally released, but we already migrated them. So they will be available from day one on. Yeah, I think that's a wrap. Thank you so much, everyone. I hope you will enjoy yFiles more than this very long session today. So please try out yFiles, try the early access version. Give us your feedback. Let us know how we did. I'm positive that you will like it, just the same that we like it. And with that, all the best to you. Happy diagramming.